The CNBC app. Global market news in one place. Customizable sections and personalized alerts. Stocks tracking, interactive charts and market insights all in your hands. Stay connected. Stay informed. Download the CNBC app today.
Happy Monday, everybody. Welcome to Squawk Box Europe. I'm Steve Sedgwick with Ben Boulos, and these are your headlines. Well, apparently there's a bit of a palpable relief amongst policymakers in Munich as US Secretary of State Marco Rubio says Washington wants to reform, not abandon the Transatlantic alliance. Germany's Foreign Minister Johann Wadephul tells CNBC exclusively Rubio's speech set the path for future cooperation.
His message was clear that we were so successful in the past and we should do the job once again with new threats, with new tasks in the 21st century.
European equity markets are called higher and Wall Street gets a breather for President's Day as AI disruption fears spill across sectors. Fresh off her landslide victory, Japan's Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi gets an economic reality check as fourth quarter GDP sees a lackluster increase of just 0.2% on the year. That's well below expectations.
Very good morning, Ben. How are you?
Very well, thank you. And yourself?
Yeah, I promised the producer I wouldn't ad-lib at the top of the show and I'd go straight into the reads.
Do you want to tell the viewers why?
No.
There's no blue pick.
Oh, no, don't tell them about
pen.
Don't tell them about that. No, but in all honesty, I think the Munich Security Conference was absolutely fantastic. I thought there was so much amazing news flow. Annetta's coverage has been amazing of it as well. I'll give you one line and then I'll move on. A line from a business leader, top business leader, a European top business leader said to me this morning, oh, well, we have relief because the Americans still hate us, but they hate us more politely this year. Okay, a year on from Vice President J.D. Vance's contentious speech at the Munich Security Conference, Secretary of State Marco Rubio appeared to strike a less aggressive tone. Couldn't be much more aggressive, could it? But still affirmed the Trump administration's key talking points on Europe. Rubio called out what he called the climate cult and repeated the stance of the country's national security strategy that the continent faces, quote, civilizational erasure. The line appeared to prompt pushback from EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas, who pointed to people in Canada who want to join the EU as an example of the bloc's strength. Well, calmer rhetoric. Can you have calmer rhetoric? I guess you can. Calmer rhetoric from Rubio appeared to mark a softening of the vice president's stance.
We Americans may sometimes come off as a little direct and urgent in our counsel. This is why President Trump demands seriousness and reciprocity from our friends here in Europe. The reason why, my friends, is because we care deeply. We care deeply about your future and ours. And if at times we disagree, our disagreements come from our profound sense of concern about a Europe with which we are connected, not just economically, not just militarily. We are connected spiritually, and we are connected culturally. We want Europe to be strong. We believe that Europe must survive. Because the two great wars of the last century serve for us as history's constant reminder that ultimately our destiny is and will always be intertwined with yours.
The German Foreign Minister Johann Wadephul called Rubio a real partner after his speech. Annetta spoke to him and asked if he would still say that.
He was a partner before that, and of course he is still a partner for me, for Germany. The United States is a partner to us. We've been so successful in this relation as NATO partners, of course, with regard to security issues. And Marco Rubio is a very experienced politician. I know him for some time. And he delivered a speech which still assured us that we stand together in this partnership between Europe and the United States. Of course, there are some questions which we will have to discuss. But in the end of the day, it was absolutely clear. His message was clear that we were so successful in the past and we should do the job once again with new threats, with new tests in the 21st century.
A letter also asked Wadephul about the path ahead. Take a listen.
He made clear that we have common tests in the future, and the hope, the willingness from the US side, as he formulated, is there to tackle these things together with Europe. Of course, there were some issues he raised we would answer differently when it comes to the migration problem, when it comes, of course, to question how we organize our legal framework here in Europe with regard to the digital services, and of course also with the question of freedom of speech and so. But this is what we are doing on our own. And Europe has also learned that, of course, if you ask for more European sovereignty, you will receive it. And that also means that, of course, we are more independent than we were in the past. So this is a goal we are now working for. And of course, we are looking for new global partners in the world which are willing to work together with Europe. For instance, Japan, India, Brazil, and so on. So this is, I would say, if you are looking to a new global order, this means we keep our alliances, but additionally we have new global partners. And this is a good future for Europe.
Yeah, there's one partner who is actually volunteering, that is China. They want to be a strong partner for Europe as well. It seems that Europe wants to have, or Europe is actually in the middle between two new best friends. So which friend would you choose?
No, there's no equidistance to Beijing and Washington. We are, of course, allies, friends, partners of value to Washington and to the United States. And this is not so the case with China. China is a different system, autocratic system, of course. We try to have China as a partner. We're open for that. We know that China is a competitor, but it's also a systemic rival to Europe and to the free world. And this is also what we are addressing. We know that, and we are confronting, I would say, also China with that very role we see them playing. But okay, we are always open for partnership, also with China.
Look, I make no bones about it. I wish I was in Munich for this conference as well. I am fascinated by the geopolitics. I've attended a lot of these international conferences as well, a lot of the NATO meetings as well, and I would have loved to be in amongst it to just kind of work out the feelings on the ground. That said, as I mentioned at the top of the show, I don't think it changes anything. I don't think it changes anything at all. And I think absolutely the self-help that Europe needs to show, that the US president has quite clearly said now for at least 8 years, and I'll draw viewers' attention back to that extraordinary meeting in July 2018, when quite rightly the president turned round to Mark Rutte, bemoaning what Frau Merkel was doing on her policy, and basically turned around and said, look, what is going on with you, Europe? You want our defence, and yet you want to get cheap Russian gas and oil. That is unpalatable. And I've never seen such a public lambasting as that. And the president was right, of course. The president was right 8 years ago that Europe cannot have it both ways. You can't have potentially defence against the Russians while you're taking the cheap oil of them. Well, that's what Frau Merkel thought she could do. She thought this rapprochement, this Putin whispering strategy would work. Well, history has proven that it was absolutely an appalling strategy, and the policy of appeasement towards Russia clearly has not worked and emboldened Russia as well. And of course, the EU's made its own mistakes as well. So look, spin forward to 2026 as well. And what was the major event of this weekend? I'll tell you what the major event of this weekend. Marco Rubio did not attend a meeting with European leaders that was scheduled in Berlin over the weekend to talk about Ukraine. One leader called it insane as well. I mean, a lot of reporting on this, FT and others. So this shows what the US thinks about European policy making on the key issue of the day. The key issue of the day isn't Greenland. It may be for the president, but the key issue for Europe is Ukraine and ending this devastating and awful, awful war as well. And did the Secretary of State think, actually, I'll go to the meeting because I care what the Europeans think? No, he didn't. I think that was damning.
And it was probably quite damaging as well to relations. You were saying being on the ground, you get a sense of how people are feeling,
Sure.
the mood music. And lawmakers, US lawmakers who were there, said they felt they had helped patch up the relationship, despite the problems caused by the Greenland discussions. However, they said that's indelibly altered relations. They were still hearing talk about it, and it was still distracting from the bigger issues of the threat from China, the threat from Russia, the war in Ukraine. And although they were saying that people in Europe seem to have breathed a sigh of relief from the more conciliatory tone, the softer tone perhaps that they heard from Rubio, all of that can easily be undone by one social media post. If the president decides that actually he's going to bring the Greenland issue back again,
it's a very good point.
All of that
the president wasn't speaking. That's absolutely the case.
And that's it, exactly. But really interesting, as you say, the sense that you get on the ground. Of course, the headlines all focused around Marco Rubio's speech about this slightly less confrontational tone, but dig into the weeds a little and you find that actually there are still other issues at play, and the shadow of that threat over Greenland, or is it a threat? It was a threat over Greenland.
Very much so.
It still looms large.
Absolutely. Mette Frederiksen was saying the same as well. Even the comments from Lindsey Graham, which were quite extraordinary, where I think he pretty much said, who cares about Greenland? Well, as someone pointed out to him, the people of Greenland really care about Greenland as well, and who owns it as well.
And let's see it symbolically, not just symbolically. I think there's a visit. I think the Danish King, Denmark royal family. I think there's a 3-day visit to Greenland happening later this week. Again, fairly symbolic. Right. In spite of all, not in spite of, especially given all that's been going on.
So look, the Munich Security Conference I would suggest, just confirmed a lot of things to Europeans. Self-help is the way forward in many ways. Of course, the NATO treaty is absolutely pivotal, and hopefully the US isn't walking away anytime soon. And the US is, without doubt, a partner. But Europe needs to get its act together. It needs to continue with getting towards this 5% of GDP defence commitment, which is 3.5% for real spending plus 1.5% for infrastructure, which was agreed last year at The Hague, a meeting I was at as well. So it needs to really just push ahead very, very aggressively and quickly with shoring up its own defences, and it needs to work out its own strategy on Ukraine as well, because at the moment, given the fact that Rubio didn't even see the need to meet with European leaders, it seems that the US is once again calling the shots on Ukraine. Until Europe is stronger militarily, that is going to maintain the case as well. Let us move on, because I mentioned Ukraine a few times there. President Zelensky says discussions of concessions to end the war in Ukraine too often focus on his country instead of Russia, accusing Moscow of seeking to delay negotiations by changing its lead representative ahead of further talks in Geneva this week. Speaking at the Munich Security Conference, Zelensky also weighed in on Ukraine's path to EU membership, saying the country will be ready to join the bloc by 2027. I find that an extraordinary statement, by the way, but we'll come back to that later. And that a date for accession should be included in a peace agreement with Russia. Annetta spoke to two top EU diplomats about the bloc's support for Ukraine and what should be done to end the conflict.
Appeasement always brings new wars, and that's very clear. If you think that, okay, let them have this territory so we will have peace, that is actually never going to work. It actually increases the appetite. They walked away with more territory, more valuables than they had before. So actually aggression works. Let's do it again.
We had been very clear that we will continue to provide Ukraine with all necessary support, and especially in the current situation where President Trump administration is not providing further financial or military support to Ukraine, we had to step up our support quite substantially.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio has been touring Central Europe since his speech, vowing to deepen cooperation with the region as he visits the Trump-friendly leaders of Slovakia and Hungary. Rubio said the Trump administration plans to make Central Europe a key component of how America engages with the world. Annetta spoke to foreign ministers from around Europe at the Munich Security Conference and got their take on the Transatlantic alliance ahead of Rubio's speech.
The transatlantic link is really strong. And this is not just the European thinking, this is American thinking as well. And again, it only makes sense that Europe invests more in its own defense and deterrence.
We have always said that a strong European pillar of NATO would strengthen NATO. It would be like saying that a very strong American army would weaken NATO. The more all the allies we have strength and deterrence in our hands, the better
for everyone and for Euro-Atlantic security.
Everyone who talks about independence from United States in defense must, answer the question about the nuclear deterrence. That was the point.
Coming up on the show, fears over AI disruption sparked a sell-off in a number of sectors last week. We'll look ahead to what markets hold in store for the week ahead. Plus, what does a strong Swiss franc mean for the country's central bank? And we'll bring you more from our conversations at the Munich Security Conference, including from the Lithuanian Foreign Minister. Stay tuned.
Executive Decisions is the new podcast from CNBC, where I ask powerful leaders about their decisions that changed everything. I'm Steve Sedgwick. Here's Miss Jo Malone at CBE.
I started that first business of skincare. That's when I knew that I was in charge of my own life. And that's when the entrepreneur really, although I didn't know what the word entrepreneur meant, that's when the entrepreneur really took hold.
That's Executive Decisions with me, Steve Sedgwick. Get it wherever you're listening to this.
The AI sell-off rocked global equities last week as investors raised concerns over the level of disruption the technology will bring to a whole range of industries. Shares in software makers, logistics companies and more sank last week over a number of days following the release of new tools from Anthropic. Let's take a look at how the US markets ended the week. And although actually I should say they're closed for President's Day, public holiday today, but they all ended last week lower. The Nasdaq seeing the biggest sell-offs, finishing 2.1% down by Friday. The S&P and Dow both down more than 1% on the week. Across the sectors, utilities were the best performing, ending the week 7% higher. Best weekly performance since June 2022. Financials, the main laggard across the week, down 4.8%. Of course, we had that US inflation data out on Friday. Let's have a look at what effect that had on the session. The US inflation data showed that in January, the annual rate was at 2.4%. It had fallen more than expected, prompting some traders on futures markets to increase their bets on the likelihood of a third rate cut by the Fed this year. We'd already been seeing 2 rate cuts widely expected, a third now hitting a likelihood of 50%. Right. We can hear more from Steve Leisman.
Markets thinking tame U.S. inflation numbers from January will allow the Fed to cut earlier and maybe more often than expected. But economists are not yet ringing the all-clear bell on inflation in the United States. Headline inflation coming in at 0.2% month-on-month, better than the 0.3% estimate for a 2.4% year-over-year rate. The core monthly rate is 0.3%, as expected, going down to 2.5%, right around the estimate. The June rate cut had been priced in for a while, but probabilities have grown now for a second cut in December, a cut that had been marked more for December. And now there are 50-50 odds of a third cut this year, which would bring the funds rate down to 3.25%. The trouble for the Fed is that it follows the PCE inflation measure, a separate measure that uses data from this CPI report. And today's inflation number has some economic forecasters actually increasing their estimate for the PCE number. That would keep the core metric over 3% versus the Fed's 2% target, and it could stay the Fed's hand for a while. Tariffs also continue to enter the debate. Core goods prices were flat. That's a good sign. That's where the tariffs have been. But that was flattered by a 1.8% decline in used car prices. Appliances were up 1%, tools up 0.8%. Those are strong monthly gains for products whose prices are expected to be affected by tariffs. Goldman Sachs writing, core goods excluding used cars increased by the fastest sequential pace since early 2023, possibly reflecting start of the year price increases and upward pressure from tariffs. If January sees the bulk of those price increases, then the way could be clear for the Fed cuts this year, especially if the strong jobs report ends up being more an exception than the rule. Several reports have suggested it may have overstated the strength in payrolls, and especially if we keep getting that weakness in housing inflation. That's been a big part of what's been keeping inflation down in the U.S. Steve Leisman, CNBC Business Report.
So, Leisman, awesome commentator and awesome analysis. For me, the key line from Leisman there was when he mentioned Goldman Sachs. And again, we're going into core here, okay? I know it's a bit in the weeds, but I think it's absolutely pivotal, right? Core goods, excluding used cars. So, Leisman, they're talking about the 1.8% decline in used cars, an outsized move there as well. But core goods, and I know I'm picking data just to make my point, but excluding used cars was up 0.35%. As Leisman just said, the fastest sequential pace since early 2023. So for all of you guys out there who's yeah, extra rate cuts on the table. Well, for 0.1 of a decimal, I would say that's a bit of a stretch anyway. But hey, the fastest sequential rate since early 2023, if you exclude used cars, and possibly reflecting the start of year price increases upward from tariffs. Video and audio product prices, right? Wait for this. Video and audio product prices increased at the fastest ever monthly pace in January, up 2.2%. Look, I'm not trying to say that the inflation beast has or hasn't been slayed. All I'm telling you is there's a couple of components in there that are really making this data very interesting as well. Ben.
Obviously it's worth remembering that it does remain above target, and so it's still above the 2%. I mean, let's say the pricing in for the likelihood of a third rate cut only up to 50%, so certainly not a sure bet as things stand.
The other thing to say, of course, is that all bets are going to change. What are we now? We're February, March, April, May. May is when we get potentially Warsh in as the chair. Now, look, he's one person. You are absolutely right, you lot there, who point out it's one person. It's not going to change the broader composition of the FOMC. But obviously, the chair of the FOMC has an outsized weighting. So I think that's absolutely fascinating what that means. Right, let's take a look at Asian indices. It's a funny old week because, of course, what we've got, of course, is the President's Day holiday today to mark, I think it's George Washington's birthday, which I think is on the 22nd, isn't it? 22nd of Feb, George Washington? Anyway, but we're marking it today, so, welcome the anniversary. So the US markets are shut, bond markets are shut, equity markets are shut as well. Plus, a lot of Asian markets are closed for Lunar New Year holidays. So let's take a look at what we've got. Nikkei down 0.2%, ASX 200 up by a similar margin. Right, Japan's economy eked out, what a great word, eked out. Is that an onomatopoeia? Is that what you call it? I think it is. Just 0.2% growth in the fourth quarter, significantly missing market forecasts of 1.6%. Wow. What do all those market experts and economists get paid for if they're going to miss it by that much a margin? Just saying. The data comes from... Maybe we could AI them. No, I'm joking. The data comes fresh off Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi's election victory and marks a key test for her government that plans to increase investment through targeted public spending. Lisa Kim followed this report.
Japan's preliminary GDP data for the October to December period showed that country's economy grew at an annualized pace of 0.2%, hugely missing analyst estimates that it would expand by 1.6%. But the Q4 result is a reversal from the previous quarter when annualized GDP contracted by more than 2%. On a quarterly basis, the Japanese economy grew 0.1%, narrowly avoiding a technical recession. And in reaction to the weaker than expected numbers, the yen slightly weakened during Asia trading, and this largely due to speculation that it would be difficult for the Bank of Japan to deliver an early rate hike, and the rate gap between the U.S. and Japan would continue to remain wide. When it comes to private consumption, which accounts for more than half of that country's GDP, it grew by 0.1% from the previous quarter, largely in line with expectations and largely flat from the previous quarter. A recent Nikkei poll showed that the Takaichi cabinet's approval rating remains high at near 70%, but respondents said that they want to see the cabinet control inflation. That, of course, after the cost of living crisis was front and center in the recent snap election. Last but not least, when it comes to CapEx, it grew by 0.2%, hugely missing analyst estimates that it would expand by 0.8%, though it jumped back after contracting in the previous quarter. quarter. The BOJ's quarterly Tankan survey released in December, which measures business confidence, reached a 4-year high among large manufacturers, but businesses said that they expect conditions to take a turn in the first quarter of this year, partially due to Japan's renewed tensions with China. For CNBC Business News, I'm Lisa Kim.